On next, I've already presented Erica Hagen. As Rupert was mentioning, she's part of the Map
Hi.
Kibera project and GroundTruth initiative. And following with the topic, we're going to be also talking about ethical geography and humanitarian mapping. Thank you, Erica. Please take it away.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay. Um, so just kind of perfectly segueing from from that conversation, I think. I about a year ago um, joined a fellowship program with the American Geographical Society called Ethical Geo Fellows. And my primary purpose in joining that, well, the ethics and geography is something that I feel like I've been interested in talking about for 10 years. I originally co-founded Map Kibera, in case there's a few of you here that don't know me. And I've been working with Map Kibera, which is works with OpenStreetMap in Kenya, primarily in informal settlements of Nairobi. So um, thinking about ethics and mapping has been top of mind for that length of time. um, and so this fellowship allowed me to look at researching what would be some principles or an actual code of ethics for mapping with particularly vulnerable communities. So I chose the word vulnerable without, I don't love the word, but basically trying to highlight that this is not necessarily an ethics of mapping for the whole globe. This is working with people who are in some way or coming from communities and doing mapping in our own communities, which are vulnerable to whether it's natural disaster, climate change, or economic shocks. So that includes, say, slum communities. It could include rural communities, which are often marginalized in many ways, and it could include refugee camps. It could include any kind of vulnerable community. So this is not an easy task to set up kind of a code of ethics. And what it was intended to be was extremely participatory. And so what I did was I definitely talked to a number of people who work with communities and come from these vulnerable communities. But I kind of ended up doing a lot of this as a draft. So what this really is a draft for you to weigh in on, not for, it's not final, let's just say. Um, yeah, so let me just go ahead and move on. So what I did was I looked at existing frameworks of ethics and data, particularly the realm of responsible data. So this has been a really hot topic recent years. Responsible data, everyone has a code of ethics in their sort of NGO about how they treat private data, as far as data being a real currency, as they say now. So looking at what might be applicable to geodata, I reviewed something called the Belmont Report, which I'll describe in a minute. OECD has a framework on responsible data that's been influential, and Oxfam has a very influential responsible data framework. So really thinking about this, can this apply to us in OSM and us doing mapping in our communities as well as other communities? What aspect of this can apply to us? The ethical geo project is not OSM centric, especially. AGS is all kinds of geographers. So this is not meant to apply only to OSM mapping, but that's my background. So I'm particularly thinking about that. Okay, so first of all, the Belmont Report. It came out in the 70s. It was really all about research subjects and being responsible when doing human subject research. So really about individual research. But it's formed a basis for almost all of this other ethics around data that I've found. So the first aspect of it, okay, let me just start. The first aspect of it is respect for persons, and the second is beneficence, and the third is justice. So I used this to outline this tentative draft of geoethics. Respect for persons incorporates at least two ethical convictions. First, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and second, that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. So this generally requires research subjects, which of course we're not working with research subjects, but bear with me, provide informed consent. In turn, informed consent has three elements: information, comprehension, and voluntariness. Other values such as privacy and autonomy may also be captured by this principle. Beneficence, this is their term, basically encompasses do not harm and maximize potential benefits and minimize harms to the, quote, subject of the research. So balance the benefits of the research and the data against any potential harm. And third, justice. Who ought to receive benefits of the research and bear the burdens? This is a question of justice in terms of fairness of distribution. Okay, so that's the Belmont Report from the 70s. And moving forward, we can see that like the OECD took on some of these same kind of framings, looking at privacy of data, collection limitation, don't only collecting data that's necessary for the project and so forth. And then
Erica, I
Oxfam.
don't see the slides moving, sorry.
Oh, they're not supposed to move yet. They're not moving. Oxfam covers topics around rights. So framing this from a rights perspective, right to be counted and heard, right to dignity and respect, right to make an informed decision, and right to privacy, and then right to not to be put at risk. Sorry, I don't actually have a lot of slides, so they're not moving. So drawing from that context, I think that while this is all about individual research and we're talking about open mapping, there is a crossover when we're talking about the rights of people, both to be heard and to make an informed decision, who live in the communities we're mapping. So I also looked at PPGIS, Public Participatory GIS, as some and sets of ethics that they propose. I think that what Emily was saying earlier really fits into this PPGIS ethics. They, the proponents of PPGIS, which I believe that the best mapping is often done in this form, believe you should ask questions like who participates, who decides who should participate, whose voice counts, who owns the outputs, who owns the maps and the data, which of course in our case is open data, but thinking about that ahead of time, should all the data be open, and who benefits from the project you're doing. I also looked a little bit into Indigenous data ethics, which is what Emily was sharing about earlier, and open geodata in terms of the open data frameworks, like FAIR data frameworks. Data should be open by default, timely and comprehensive, accessible and usable, and so forth. So bringing these together, you get a pretty interesting ethical background, I would say, that can be useful here. Okay, so just on to the draft, and I'm going to rush through this. But this is exactly what I'd like feedback on, so you can contact me directly or put things in the chat. I will also post a link to the document itself. So first of all, going in that category of respect, which contains consent, privacy, and participation. Okay, so my suggested guidelines here with regard to mapping, specifically, let's see. I have too many of these pieces of paper. Okay, conducting, wait, sorry. These are out of order. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Consent. Making a good faith effort to engage the community to be mapped and obtain consent. You might be thinking, how is that possible? How do you know who to ask? How do you approach a community, a geographical area of some sort, and look for consent? But I suggest you can go one step further, engaging with community members in the mapping process and working with meaningful participation can overcome some of these troubles around figuring out who to ask for consent and who's going to sign what document. I don't think it needs to look like that. So that would be one way to go about it. As far as privacy, I think we already know that we should protect individual privacy and not include PII, private and personally identifiable information in our open maps. But that also brings up issues of aerial imagery and satellite imagery are becoming more precise and high and detailed. Do these invade privacy at times? Drone imagery, does that invade privacy? So there still needs to be emphasis on this aspect. Okay, and as far as benefit in this category, we want to look at risk, cost, extraction, purpose, duplication. So basically, who are we benefiting with the project? So if we're going to do a mapping exercise, can we do a cost benefit or risk benefit analysis first? I think that this is rarely done in OpenStreetMap projects in a formal sense. We can also promise to provide maps and data back to a community and not do extractive mapping. This is much more difficult than it looks like. This is actually a painting that we did on a wall to try to provide data back. It's not easy to do a painting on a wall to set it up, but it's pretty impactful. Purpose limitation, only collecting what's necessary for the project. This is perhaps difficult during OSM work because we also want to say if the community wishes to map more than is in your project, maybe we can expand the actual limitations and the boundaries of a project. So we might be focusing on one thing for one humanitarian purpose. Can we expand that? And non-duplication of other data sets, working jointly and coordinating with other projects that are going on. This is very challenging oftentimes. And finally, justice. This is probably my favorite kind of framing, is just looking at it through the lens of justice. If we look at opportunity and capacity development as a way to better distribute and provide equity in the distributes of risks and benefits among community members and stakeholders, it's a whole different way of approaching the idea of this distribution. So how do we create local opportunity, capacity, economic opportunity? This doesn't give you a guide for the how. It's really just a way to set up the concept that there should be equal opportunity, or at least better attempt at that, considering the distribution of burdens and benefits, and really looking at like how do local people benefit each time we do mapping. Distribution and sustainability. So sustainability being a topic that I've also gotten into depth in another talk on. So I think there's a lot of considerations here. I briefly mentioned in the previous session about the economics of mapping. I think this can fall under justice. Geospatial industries are creating job opportunities, but are they proportional to the sector's wealth in local contexts? How do we protect people from being sort of used as data collectors or human sensors without a clear benefit to themselves? And this also applies to researchers. I've seen all kinds. It's not just about like businesses trying to gather data, but even during academic research, there can be a lot of work with communities, but then nothing sort of coming back. Yeah, I mean, basically this opens a lot of sort of Pandora's boxes, I think, because this might sound, I'd be curious, like this might sound like, oh yeah, this is definitely what we're already doing. Of course, mapping happens this way. I appreciate that this is the direction that the norms are heading, and even to the extent that Tyler made a lot of mention of some of this sort of devolution and some of this these same ethical topics in his introduction to the summit. So I appreciate that. I think that therefore, let's have more voices weigh in on if does this capture the ethics that we want, and recalling that principles of behavior do not dictate that every project has to follow these. Principles of responsibility and ethics are more of an ideal, so they may never ever be achieved in their perfect form. They can provide something to shoot for and just a way to keep tabs on whether we all are sharing the same values when we are mapping. Thanks. I'd love to take questions and comments.
Thank you so
or
much,
Edgar,
Erika.
how do you want to proceed?
I think we could keep on answering on the chat as they come along, just to keep on with the agenda. But thank you so much for that presentation. It was very thorough. I was aware of the OECD guide, but not the other resources. So thank you for highlighting them. And I'm very much looking forward to reading the draft on the guide. And I think it's going to be very meaningful and very useful for our work. But
Can I put let me, somebody
yes,
just
please.
mentioned, if I put the link in the doc, I don't know if this session is closing right now or if somebody's after me.
We
I
have
have to find the link.
an incoming session, but we can keep on sharing it. No, the room stays open. We have another session, but please feel free to drop any questions for Erica on the chat, and we'll be answering those there. And we can also share the link to the document for the draft of the guide there too. Up
Okay.
next, we're
Thank
gonna
you.
no, thank you so much, Erica.
Yeah.
Up next,